So it's been a couple of weeks since I was able to do one of these. We're under new management at work, and I suppose anybody who's ever had to deal with new management or deal with new managers in your department or in your in your company, I'm sure you can feel my pain with that. They come in and they got their own new rules and regulations, and they've decided how they're going to do everything, and they change everything around, and everybody has to kind of suffer for a little while anyway. But anyway, about a week and a half ago, I was looking through these articles about the serial killer in Ontario, Canada. It's pretty twisted. It's almost like Gacy. And he killed eight men, and his name is Bruce MacArthur. And there was a video on YouTube about how he used Alcoholics Anonymous meetings to pick up men. And the funny thing about it was this AA member immediately had to jump up and get on the camera, and he had to say, we knew from the get-go there was something wrong with him. We knew he wasn't taking his recovery seriously. We asked him to leave. We knew that he was there just to 13-step people, and we just told him in no uncertain terms, AA does not allow a 13-step. And it's just such fucking bullshit. It's a fucking lie, because I've seen this kind of excuse thrown around before. Whenever you bring up the bad behavior that goes on in AA meetings, somebody inevitably somewhere has to jump up and say nothing like that has ever happened in one of my meetings, or they have to say something like, we've seen people like that before and we all had to run them off. And I think anybody who's been in AA for a long period of time knows what a crock of shit that is. For one thing, a lot of the so-called old-timers and a lot of the trusted servants are the ones that's doing all the predatory behavior, all the vile, underhanded behavior. But it made me think of another case, actually. It happened in one of the home groups I had, and it even made the local news a couple of times. It was this guy, he was coming around, and he had a really good story going on, and he got popular immediately, and he was one of those people that was chairing all the meetings, and he was speaking every meeting. He was getting called on. He had all this spiritual stuff to say. I remember his favorite line that he liked to say a lot of the times was, "It is what it is," And I remember someone had overdosed and died one time from a drug overdose, and he said, anytime that we're, tempted to question why these kinds of things happen, you just have to say it is what it is. Nothing happens in God's world by mistake. He was one of those kind of assholes. But he got involved in this child custody case, and apparently it had something to do with domestic violence even. And I remember at the time, he got all these AA people to go downtown to court with him, and none of them had a bit of problem going down there and giving false testimony about where he was supposed to have been when some kind of activity happened. They just said he was at AA meetings. And it's funny that later on they all denied that they'd ever done that by the time what further developed down the road. But he managed to win custody in the situation. And then, like a few months later, he made the local news. He was a big restaurant owner. It was one of the reasons it got into the news. But he had beat up his girlfriend. She had locked herself in the bathroom trying to get away from him. And he broke down the door and he beat her up in front of her kids and his kid or something like that. And he was looking at some time in jail. I don't remember how he wiggled his way out of that one, or if he got probation or whatever the fuck it was. But then it was like 6 or 7 months later, maybe a year later, he made the news again, and he had assaulted a toddler. He's a real piece of shit, He had beat up a toddler, and due to the serious nature of the toddler's injuries, he was going to get 15 to 20 years in prison. And at the time, since he was, you had one half of AA that was saying, well, you got to remember, we're all sick in here. We're all alcoholics and we're all sick. And, who are you to judge? I thought, well, it's really interesting because he was one of those people that had a problem with me coming around picking up white chips. And, when I picked up a 90-day chip one time, I remember he said, how long is this one going to last before you have to get drunk again? When are you going to get honest, do the program? And, all these little buddies were all behind me, behind that one too. They were all like, if you're not really working the program as God intended it to, then you're just wasting everybody's time. They were in that bandwagon. And it was kind of like, once I found out what kind of piece of shit he was, it was like, wow. But it's really interesting how the same people that had a problem with me, my worst crime was drinking again, all of a sudden wanted to preach this doctrine of total forgiveness for someone that beat a toddler. It just tells you what kind of shit these people really are. Because after all, when he beat that kid up, he was sober, I'm sure. But it got me to thinking about how many times I've seen this kind of thing happen over the years in AA. When people make excuses for predatory behavior, they'll either say the person is sick, that they can't help it, but they don't have that same level of tolerance for someone who's drinking or someone who returns to drugs. They don't have that same level of tolerance for someone who commits suicide, or that level of sympathy. But if you're an old-timer and you're a child molester, you're a rapist, or you're the kind of person that would, steal from people out of their wallets, if you got 20 years sober, you're fine. In the case of this Bruce MacArthur dude, I wasn't at those meetings up there. I don't know what it's like, but it's kind of eerie to me how many people I talk to online, all over the country, all over the world for that matter, that all have stories almost identical to mine own when it comes to the horror that goes on in AA. I mean, case after case after case of low-life old-timers, twisted religious mania, suicides, severe relapses and deaths. And it seems like the prevailing predominant attitude is almost universal when it comes to AA and AA meetings. So you could say that I have pretty good reason, rather than just my own anecdotal evidence or, my own observations, for being highly skeptical of these AA people that all of a sudden want to wash their hands of, what happened. I mean, one motherfucker even had the nerve to comment and say, AA probably saved some people's lives. How the fuck did AA save anybody's lives? The guy still murdered people. I mean, did they call the police? Did they do anything legally for the so-called, because they acted like he was doing something real shady in the meetings, and they can't tolerate that. The funny thing about that is the guy actually says in the video that the 13th step doesn't exist. Well, if the 13th step doesn't exist, how the fuck are you talking about it then? But it almost reminds me of, it was an old film, Dr. Zhivago, when, the Soviets were taking over. There was a common thing that happened actually during Stalin's reign as well, is anytime there was a kind of crime that was kind of unspeakable, or anytime there was a hint of something rotten in society, they just said it didn't exist. There's a scene in the film where, the doctor says, I heard there's typhus in the city. And the Communist Party leader looks at him and says, obviously, doctor, you've been listening to propaganda. There's no typhus in this city. And then later on in the film, when he has to treat a patient, the same communist leader says, what's wrong with this patient? He said, it's another problem that we don't have in Moscow that doesn't exist. It's propaganda. It's starvation. It kind of reminds me of the same thing, the way they pretend that this problem doesn't exist, or that, even worse, they'll say things like, well, predators are everywhere. So by their logic, if predators are everywhere and this kind of behavior that's going on is everywhere, then they should do absolutely nothing to even try to attempt to make their fellowship even remotely safe. They should just keep on doing the same shit. But the fact of the matter is, they're not really concerned about predators as long as the predators are old-timers, as long as they're sober. They're not really worried about the fact that vulnerable, innocent people who are there to overcome problems for their addictions go there seeking help, and they end up being victimized, or at worst, they end up being picked up by some fucking serial killer. And the only thing you can do in the face of 8 men brutally murdered and tortured to death is run up there on the TV to make sure everybody knows that your meeting doesn't have these kinds of problems. It doesn't exist in your meeting. It kind of reminds me of a certain home group I went to for a little while, where they were all telling me that the meeting after the meeting is the most important meeting there is. You know, you got to stick around for the meeting after the meeting. And I think I've told this before, but it's so applicable here. I went to one of these coffee shop places, and they're sitting around and they're repeating their sponsees' fist steps, and they're naming their sponsees' names, and they're laughing. And they're talking about, you know, their sponsees' kids and the problems they're having. And, you know, like one particular instance, they're like, well, you know, his 16-year-old daughter's already a slut, so we know what kind of dad he is. You know, typical snarky-ass fucking gossip. But the thing that was so killer to me about it was like 2 or 3 nights later in an AA meeting, they were talking about gossip. And, you know, how gossip is just such an awful thing. And these very same people that were just having a ball talking about all these people were saying, yeah, you know, anything that's said to me in the strictest of confidence, it goes nowhere. You know, I would never violate someone's trust. And, you know, they even said, I even heard of some meetings where some people did something like that. And, you know, the meeting people took them aside, ran them away. You know, you're kind of like you knew about the serial killer in advance and you ran him away. But, you know, it often left me with a puzzling question. Do these people compartmentalize so much that they really believe the lies they're telling when they're sitting there in meetings? Or are they just such narcissistic, monstrous assholes in their behavior that they just don't care? I mean, I'm a lot of things. I'm not some upright moral Puritan. I'm nowhere near close to it. Don't pretend to be. But I guess one thing I never could stand for whatever reason was hypocrisy. I mean, like, you could be the worst scumbag on the face of the earth, and if you weren't pretending to be virtuous, somehow or the other, I could actually get along with you better, you know, than I can the phony type of thing like that. I mean, you know, maybe it's just a catch-22 of mine. It might be the reason why I've been kind of a misfit and can't fit in with people most of my life. Used to bother me when I was a younger man. Now, it's actually, after seeing the world and what kind of people are in it, who would want to be a part of it, you know? But, you know, the idea that this whole not in my meeting thing, that they'll feed that lie to people probably. I mean, I'm sure that there are newcomers out there right now, you know, that have read about this kind of thing or heard about these kinds of things and know about these kind of things, and they're assured by people who they're putting their trust into to help them that these things don't go on much. You know, they happen once in a great while, or they certainly don't happen at this meeting. We never allow no bad behavior like that to go unchecked at meetings like this one. And, you know, the meeting spot you're sitting in might be the worst place on earth when it comes to trusting anyone. Not that I've ever seen anything remotely close to a safe AA meeting. But, yeah, I don't think this story needs to die for several reasons, but I think first and foremost, you know, spread it around that, yeah, people have used AA. A serial fucking killer has used AA to find victims. You know, best lesson you could take away from that, if you know someone who's in AA or if you're still active in AA, you know, just because someone is sitting there saying they got 20 years and can quote the big book or whatever, certainly doesn't give you any grounds to trust those people whatsoever, or even call those people sponsors and put your trust in them. You know, I can't tell you about how many sponsors I've seen that just fuck people's lives up just for the fun of it. I know that sounds really rudimentary to say you can't trust everyone in AA, but it's kind of weird when you get tied up into a religious cult, how they can fuck with your rational thought, and they can actually deceive you so easily. But, you know, yeah, it definitely spread that around all over the place. Yeah, the guy that you're talking to that's claiming all this sobriety, he might be someone like that piece of shit that had a problem with me picking up white chips that goes around beating up women and children, or he could be a fucking serial killer looking for another victim. I guess that's pretty much a brief synopsis of what I wanted to talk about in this video. Hopefully by next week, new managers will try to do something with our mess, and I'll have a little bit more spare time on my hands, and you won't have to wait so long for the next installment. But until next time,